Good day and welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. In this video we're going to take a look at Uldaman, the Lost Legacy tier, and basically see how we can complete it at 10 plus with relative ease. So I'm starting to do some Mythic Plus guides. I'll be uploading them when and whenever I can. But yeah, so just a couple things. Firstly, location of the dungeon was shown at the beginning of the video, a nice little nifty portal to get there. There's a crumbling iron vein or mineral vein at the beginning of the dungeon. If you have the mining profession, you can farm that for a tome that will give you 10% increase in speed. Those are located throughout the dungeon, so I highly suggest you pick them up if you have a miner in the group. Along the way to the Lost Dwarves, there's not anything too much really that you need to be aware of. As a tank, be careful of how many vicious basilisks you pull at one time. They provide a chomp, and the follow-up bleed effects can deal some pretty decent damage to you. The hulking berserkers also you need to be careful of, because when you stack them together, they will increase the amount of damage that everyone takes by 20%, but also increase the amount of damage that they do by 20%. You don't really need to pick up any additional mob packs here. You can basically just go in a straight line through to the boss, so there's not really anything too crazy. The Stone Vault Geomancers that you see, you want to prioritize interrupting their stone spikes and chain lightnings to reduce some of the AoE damage that your healer will partake in. The Lost Dwarves themselves, things are relatively simple. Be wary of Olaf's Recting Shield. Eric the Swift will occasionally drop Skullcracker, which will deal damage to everyone, interrupt defensive bulwark from Olaf, and they will hop onto the longboat at certain health thresholds. Try to basically stack together when they're on the longboat rather than spreading out, as this will make the fire more concentrated than anything else. Basically, if Balog is casting Wild Cleave as a tank, you kind of want to make sure that you cast your damage mitigation there. It will also cleave anyone in front of you, so make sure that you face Balog away from the fight. It's basically that. Just keeping Balog out the way is basically all you need to be aware of. And then essentially Eric the Swift, the healer, needs to watch out for a dagger throw, as that will cause damage to any random party member. There is also the big damage from the kind of longboat phase, so healers may want to save some cooldowns for an AoE session there. But as long as the tank is facing Balog away from the party, generally speaking, you shouldn't have any massive issues, to be honest with you. So that kind of covers them. Obviously, ideally, you want to nuke them all down at similar times rather than focusing down, one boss at a time, because then they'll hop in the ship and constantly cast fire. But yeah, the next boss is Bromach. Now, there's a cool strategy here where basically you can pull the hulking berserkers into the fight and then have them kind of boost your DPS against them, but I wouldn't suggest it. The big strategy here is basically you need to keep control of the mobs. Now, the mobs are basically, pretty big, problem in this fight. And the easiest way to handle them is to just move the entire pack towards the totem, nuke the totem down, and then you will stun everyone, including the boss. You can nuke everyone down and then basically reset the fight. That's pretty much all you really need to do, which basically is the most important thing. If he casts Bloodlust, you need to dispel it. DPS, you can interrupt some Stone Vault Geomancers. Make sure you focus the totem, but only once the tank has him in range. Basically, tanks just pull aggro on all of the mobs, and make sure you stack everyone under the Quaking Totem. That's probably the most important thing you need to do. And then, with the healing is, again, pretty much just essentially keep your cooldowns when the totem's up as best you can, especially if you struggle with AoE healing. And from there, you should be fine. So, pretty straightforward fight, as long as you follow, keeping the totem in check. It can be a bit difficult. It's hard to keep track of all of the ads. So, might take you a bit of practice if you're the tank. When you are traveling to the next boss, Talondras, be aware of Earth Custodians. You want to make sure that the Custodians face away from the party, ideally, as they have a cleave that can cause quite significant damage to the rest of the party. They also do Rending Slash, so try and use some mitigation, as you saw there on the screen, you can take quite a bit of damage. The Refty Custodian basically sticks along, but you don't really need to do anything here. Honestly speaking, you can just remove the buff on them and you're basically kind of done with that job. So the trash mobs aren't too bad here. You should ideally pull both of those parties together, as you can handle the additional Refty Custodian without anything too crazy. Then you come to Sentinel Talondras. Honestly, I don't really find them to be that crazy a fight. Basically, you just need to avoid making contact with any resonating orbs, which is something you need to be aware of. DPS, you need to use some defensive cooldowns if you have the Earthen Shard stack on you, and basically the tank, you need to make sure you run the boss through the orbs. That is the _1 activity here. If you run the boss through all the orbs, it will stun the boss and basically prevent them from performing their soft enrage. Healers, again, just monitor the debuff that can appear on the DPS. It's super important, and once you do that, you should be able to manage everything fine. The big thing here is, as DPS, you can line the orbs up to make it a much easier kind of process for everyone involved. We then come to the trash here. So there's a couple of things you can do here to make your life easier. There's a couple of new mobs that have been added in. So Earthen Weavers, basically there's a lot of spellcasters. So tanks, try and run them around corners, gather them up, AoE silence them if best. That's probably the #1 thing I can suggest. The Runic Protector, which is the big giant ass dwarf creature slam thing, you need to be aware of that. It leaves a lingering pool on the ground, which is AoE damage, and you're going to have to make sure that you avoid that. The spiders will perform pounce, so that means that they will cause some quite significant damage. You need to dispel any of the poison effects, if possible, that can appear on your tank, because it can cause you some issues. And the bat will occasionally do sonic burst. You need to interrupt it, and that basically solves it. A lot of these mobs have singular interrupts that are quite easy to handle, although as a tank, if you get hit by a couple of them, it can be quite difficult for you. Then if you take a look at Emberon himself, so Emberon's quite a distinctly difficult fight in some ways. He's quite messy, so basically you need to just spread yourselves out. When he reaches maximum energy, he's going to fire out a laser, and this laser is going to shoot out 2 sides. You can see it on the ground there and eventually in the air. You need to avoid the laser and basically kill all the adds. That's honestly really about as crazy as it is. For the DPS, I suggest spreading yourselves out and each focusing an add. In terms of tanking, there's not too much you really need to do. Ideally, you just need to watch where the frontal cone attack from the boss is facing and keep it away from your allies. Try and keep the boss relatively center in the room, because that will give the DPS the ability to weave in and out of each other and spread out. If you move them too far to one side, it makes things a little bit harder for them. Although it just depends on your party makeup. Generally speaking, ranged DPS will have a lot less of a problem here than others. You can see the cone attack there that you need to avoid. And then healers, you need to just remove and dispel burning heat over time, and basically just pop your cooldowns again during the 4 keepers phase, because once again, it's a pretty rough phase overall. So yeah, should be relatively easy, but again, it can be challenging. Just depends on what your build is like and what your class is like and everything along those lines. Realistically speaking, it's just a messy fight, but as long as you keep your eye and just avoid the attacks running around, it's actually not too difficult a fight at all. Now the trash to Chrono-Lord Deios is pretty simple. So there's a couple things just to be aware of. The Ebonstone Golem, those big golems are not great. They do Thunderous Clap, and this does very big damage to nearby melee units. So keep an eye on this. Tanks, be careful of just pulling mobs relentlessly. Also, tanks, be aware of your positioning. You need to monitor very closely where the bubble that the Earthen Guardian is placing. This big mob here with the shield and the hammer, he places a little bubble. You'll see a little pop up like this. You need to move the ads out of here, otherwise it's going to be a really, really painful time trying to take them down. And yeah, basically, there's not too much else beyond that. For the little dragon guys themselves, if you've been doing the mob packs correctly, you shouldn't have too many to kill here. So you just need to be a tiny bit careful of the Infinite Time Reaver. These units can basically, they ramp themselves up over time. So if you pull too many, especially on a week where you have, big, like, AoE damage or big AoE buffs, it can be a bit of a challenge for you. So maybe consider not stockpiling too many of them together. There's also a nifty skip you can do here. If you have a rogue, you can just kind of somewhat pull yourself out of things, which makes your life a little bit easier. And then you can actually just maneuver yourself around these last two guards, because you should have just enough percentage from killing these little dragons here. And yeah, once you've done that, you can basically take on the boss, which is pretty cool. If you have a rogue, you can skip behind. Otherwise, what you can do is, you'll see this little bench here. You can actually hop off of these little benches. Yeah, see there? And hop through and past the pillar. But it's a lot easier if you got a rogue. But, hey, I never said I was here to show you me doing the hard stuff. I'm just going to tell you that you can. Now, the actual boss, Chrono-Lord Deios, is really straightforward, like super duper straightforward. So basically, you just need to dodge the ground animations and the follow-up pools. You need to be aware of the wing buffet, not because it's going to cause big damage. It does cause some damage, but so that it doesn't knock you into the eternity zones to the left, these little places on the ground. DPS, just basically make sure that you avoid falling into these. And then tanks, make sure that you face Sand Breath away from the party. That's essentially it. You just need to basically do that. Healers, there will be a move called Time Sink that will go out to random DPS. You're going to want to dispel this Time Sink so that you can have a bit of a better time in dealing with the AoE damage. But it does do AoE damage, so make sure that that DPS member is away from others. And then at certain phases, the boss will basically tell you to go into the little pools that are left behind, and you'll get a haste, which will beef up your damage. And that's that. That covers pretty much everything you need to know. It's not particularly a hard dungeon, but it does have things you do need to make sure you're on top of. Also, be incredibly careful at certain points of how many mobs you pull together. A lot of these mobs have, building up over time. Haste or damage increases at certain health thresholds, and if you're not careful and you pull too many and you don't nuke them down or keep them under control, you can end up like getting everyone very close to dying and then dying yourself. So it just makes it a lot more difficult. The bosses themselves are simple, but they do have very, very particular mechanics. For example, make sure that you run the boss through the 3 zones to stun them. Make sure that you stun the boss with the totem. Make sure that you stand in these areas to avoid damage and get haste. They're very specific mechanics, but super simple to understand. And that's that. That covers everything you need to know. This dungeon was completed on 11+ during a fortified week. And yeah, pretty straightforward. I will see you guys in the next video. Of course, if you enjoy the video, please leave a like. I greatly appreciate it. And I'll see you guys next time. Till then, bye.